The campsite manager knew too much about me. I just found out how. We all have that one family story, the one that gets trotted out at Thanksgiving, told with the same inflections and the same laughs. For my family, it was the summer of '96, and the miracle at Mirror Lake. The story went like this. When I was 5 years old, my parents took my sister and me camping at a remote lake in the Sierra Nevada. One afternoon, I wandered off from our campsite while my mum was napping and my dad was fishing. Panic ensued. The park rangers were called, and a search party was organized just as the sun began to dip below the tree line. They found me just over an hour later, sitting calmly on a fallen log about a mile down the lake's trail, completely unharmed. My parents always choked up at this part, saying an angel must have been watching over me. The official story was that I'd followed the shoreline and gotten tired. That was the legend. I had no memory of it. Fast forward 25 years. I'm 30 now. I'm living in a different state, and for my birthday, my wife surprised me with a camping trip. She'd found this highly rated, rustic camping ground called Whispering Pines. It was a bit of a drive, but it looked beautiful. She showed me the website, stunning photos of a glassy lake, dense forests, and a rugged old-school campsite manager named Jed. Something about the name of the lake made me pause. Mirror Lake. I asked my mum about it, and she confirmed it was the same place. "Oh honey, that's wonderful," she said. "You can finally see the spot where you gave us the scare of our lives." The manager back then was a grumpy old man, but the place was beautiful. We arrived on a Friday evening. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. As I checked in at the small wooden office, the manager Jed was sitting on the porch. He was a different man from the one my mum described. Younger, maybe mid-50s, with a grizzled beard and a deep set of eyes that held your gaze a little too long. He gave us a slow and deliberate smile as he handed me the key. "Back again," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. I laughed it off. First time for me. My parents brought me here when I was a kid, though. He nodded, his eyes fixed on me. "I know. Site 17. Same one I gave your folks." A little weirded out, we headed out to our site. My wife thought it was charming, a small-town character. I tried to shake it off, but then the comments started. The next morning, I was making coffee. Jed appeared on the path. "You always did like your pancakes with blueberries, if I recall," he said. Then continued to walk before I could respond. I didn't even like blueberries. My wife does. I figured he must have seen them in our cooler. On Sunday, I dropped my pocket knife. As I bent to pick it up, it was suddenly there, holding it out for me. "You always were a clumsy one, weren't you, Mikey?" He used my full name I don't go by. My wife was out of earshot. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Later that evening, as we sat by the fire, he appeared at the edge of our campsite firelight. The flames cast dancing shadows over his face, making his grin look monstrous. "Quiet night," he said, stepping closer. "Just like the last time you were here. Your folks were making a ruckus, though, weren't they? All that yelling." "My parents don't yell. They're mostly placid people." "Jed," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I don't remember anything from that trip I was 5. He chuckled. A dry, rattling sound. "Oh, I know you don't. That's the funny thing about trauma, isn't it? The mind puts up a wall." He leaned in, close enough that I could smell the tobacco on his breath. "But I remember. I remember every single person who ever camped on this land. I remember your daddy's panic. I remember your mama's tears. But most of all," he paused, his eyes glittering, "I remember finding you." The world seemed to go silent, the crackling fire suddenly deafening. "You weren't on any log by the trail," he whispered. "You were a mile in the opposite direction, in the old haunting cabin sitting in a corner, calm as you please, and you weren't alone. My blood turned to ice. My wife grabbed my arm, her nails digging in. There was another fellow in there with you, a drifter who had been squatting there for a week. We'd been trying to run him off. Jed's smile vanished. When I burst in, he was just staring at you, and you were staring right back. You pointed a little finger at him and said, "Clear as a bell. This is the man who is going to hurt me." I was speechless. This wasn't the story. This was a nightmare. The drifter went white as a ghost. He started stammering, said you just wandered in, and he was about to bring you back. But the way he looked at you, Jed shook his head. I knew. I felt it. The police came. They checked his stuff, found pictures. Other kids. He looked directly into my eyes. He was a very bad man, Mikey. And your 5-year-old self nailed him. He sat up straight, the firelight flickering behind him. The official report says you got lost and were found by a good Samaritan. Your folks wanted to protect you from the truth. They asked me never to speak of it, and I haven't, until now. He turned to leave, then paused. I saw you drive up on Friday, and I saw that man's face in my mind's eye as clear as day. You didn't just wander off, kid. You ran. You ran a mile into the woods to find that one person in the world who meant you harm. And you walked right up to him. And for the life of me, in 30 years of running this place, I've never been able to figure out, how did you know he was there? He disappeared into the darkness, leaving me and my wife sitting in stunned silence. The fire popping, the vast unknowable forest pressing in all around us. I still don't have an answer. And part of me is terrified that I never will. 1 year ago, I pulled into a social work visit. I think they were planning on eating me. 7 years open with the agency, 7 caseworkers, only 7 total sessions. Even in my line of work, the amount of turnover with this family was unheard of. And remember what I said, Beth. Whatever it takes to make this work, Connor said. My supervisor's words are ringing in my ears, even now. I had avoided this case for years, turning it down, making excuses, citing seniority. I was the company's best social worker. I just didn't need to be on shit assignments like this. The type that broke people. The type that made them disappear. As I pulled into the driveway of my 6th and final appointment of that fateful day, the sight of the house did little to quell the feelings of nausea building in my stomach. It should have been a beautiful, sprawling Cape Cod in a great neighborhood, but it had cracked, decades-old windows, a screen door that appeared to be hanging off its hinges, and a lawn that was half overgrown and half dead. Does anyone even live here? I thought to myself. I jumped as I felt my transmission slip and glanced over to see my right hand had instinctively slid the car back into reverse. Poor Rosa, I thought. My '07 flexible, rusty, worn Honda Civic had been with me since college. She traveled hundreds of thousands of miles with me. Even when my co-workers trailed up, I stayed with Rosa. I couldn't afford to do otherwise. Anyway, no one could. Except for Connor, who drove a bright green Mustang convertible. Perks of being the boss, I guess. The other perk? Not being on this case. 7 years, 7 workers, and I about to be the 8th. What is it about these places, these people, that's scaring everyone away? When Connor came to me this time, he told me that the site was going to pull the program's funding entirely if this family didn't get their mandated intake. I needed to keep this job just for a few months longer. I couldn't afford it going belly up now. I just need you to do the annual paperwork. 1 hour to get the billable session, and your role will be complete. You have my word on that, Connor said. I reached over and grabbed my thermos, unscrewing the cap and taking a sip of my homemade, still hot, vegetable soup. And then another. Anything to delay the inevitable. Every last co-worker who was pulled up on this driveway never returned to the office. They had all quit and were never heard from again. They didn't even bother to write a note to say what happened. It was like they no longer existed. I tried to skim over the case file between meetings. I didn't have time to study it beforehand. In this line of work, you never do. Every March, they schedule an intake for their mentally ill adult son, a request to begin service. Every March, they reported being extremely satisfied with the worker that was sent, and every March, they immediately discharged from the service. The only thing I had to go on were the unfinished assessments started by my co-workers, all of which were incomplete. They all had been to the home, met the mother, and then they just stopped typing, never signing off, never got through all the forms, just gone. There was one note 3 years ago, though, that really bothered me. It was like the caseworker had written a joke to herself that she intended to delete, but never got round to it. She couldn't have meant it literally, I thought, sitting here, rubbing the back of my neck, but with no other explanations to go on. It really brought a chill up my spine. I shook my head and closed my eyes as I repeated it in my mind. It said, "I think these people plan on eating me." A scream forced my eyes back open as I literally hopped out of my seat and my eyes shoot over, like a deer in headlights, to the front door. A woman standing with just one foot outside the door, the other still inside, with her hand beckoning me inside. She felt like a shadow walking in the world. Like from here, she was difficult to see, just an outline that didn't feel natural. My heart began to beat through my chest. On one hand was the car door, ready to open. On the other hand was my transmission, still in reverse. My eyes raced between the two, and then I remembered why Connor was able to convince me in the first place. The leverage he had over me. Really, the leverage I placed over myself. 9.5 years, just not 10. I needed 10. I sighed. I put Rosa into park and grabbed my work bag and my soup and headed out of the car door. Now, dearie, please come in. I'm on a very strict timeline tonight, and I just hate to be late for dinner, the woman said. There was something average-looking about Maeve that I just couldn't put my finger on, making her impossible to describe physically. Sure, she had a very cozy grandmother aesthetic to her, round glasses, round belly, curly graying hair, and a modest plain dress and apron. She was the type of person where you felt like you immediately knew, but also someone you wouldn't be able to pick out of a lineup of similar women the next day. Regardless, with every step I took behind her, my guard was up. You have to understand, I walked into strangers' houses for a living, so you adapt a certain level of observational awareness and alertness that had me noticing things about the house. Immediately I looked over and saw that the TV was at least 50 years old, and it hadn't been used in a long time. All of the living room furniture was covered in sheets. It was also extremely hot. It smelled like burning dust. You know that smell you get when you use your furnace for the first time in months? But it had been a freezing winter in the Midwest. The only rooms that appeared to be used recently were the dining room table, which I was being led to, with 2 dinner plates sitting on the opposite sides, and the kitchen, which appeared to be very clean, brightly lit, and ready. But for what? "You must be Beth. I've heard so much about you from the other girls," Maeve said, leading me into her house, giving me a curious look up and down. "I've been waiting a long time for this. You come highly recommended." "Thanks. I've been around for a while. I just really like to help people," I said robotically, as I'd said the same thing hundreds of times before. "And you must be Miss Maeve Surcat, am I right?" "That's right, darling. I see you've done your homework. So I'm sure you know we've been starved so long," Maeve responded as she offered me a seat at the dining room table. "Well," I said, sitting down, grabbing my laptop out of my bag and waking it from sleep mode, the electronic health chart already opened and ready. "I'm just here to do your annual paperwork, and then I'll be on my way, and you're going to have a new caseworker." "Oh, I have a feeling you'll be staying, darling," with a certainty in her voice that made my throat dry and my breath get short. "I'm full. Sorry, just helping out," I replied with a gulp. "It must be nice to be full," Maeve said, as she wandered off to the kitchen. Well, I don't get paid for having a full caseload, if that's what you mean, I said, hiding the lament in my voice, as I was tired of pretending that working as a salaried caseworker for Medicaid was anything but near the poverty line. I sighed and shook my head for oversharing. I can probably get out of here in an hour if I keep them focused. That'll be enough. Then I'm going home and taking a hot bath. A loud metal clang interrupted my daydream, and I looked over my laptop screen to see a magazine cover, perfect tray of cookies, cakes and pastries, along with a steaming hot pot of tea. I was a bit confused when Maeve gave a curtsy, as if she was partaking in some ancient ritual, and I watched her pick up a small plate. Now, I hope you're not too full, that you can have a snack before we begin, Maeve said. I stammered out as my stomach rumbled, betraying me as the soup I've stretched out for days was barely fighting off my fatigue, blood sugar pangs, and a need for sustenance late in the day. I'd been in this situation before. In some cultures, offering a guest something to eat and drink upon arrival was customary. The safest route was just to eat something. Anything, regardless of whether you were hungry or not. It was considered an insult in many cultures to decline an offering, even politely. And the last thing I wanted to do was insult this woman. I picked up a cookie with bright pink frosting and just held it up to my lips. I took a moment to take in the smell. I think I let out a moan from my lips. It had been so long since I've had real butter. Just as I could taste the dough in my mouth and began to sink my teeth in, I saw a flash in Maeve's eyes that froze me in place. I didn't know how to describe the look. A look of eagerness, relief, culmination. There was something very primal about it. My body responded in the opposite vein. I'd frozen, my limbic brain sending the fight or flight response as it processed something my conscious mind couldn't fully grasp. I was face to face with a predator. I'm all right, really. I just need to get this assessment done, I said as I sat down the cookie. As I did, the look of shock and disbelief grew by the second, and I rushed to explain myself and move on, sweat forming on my chest as I'd hoped I'd made the right choice. I'm really sorry, Miss Maeve, but the thing is, I'm vegan, so... Vegan? She exclaimed, so loudly that her body physically shifted in her seat. I prepared to apologize, somehow, for my own diet. But then I watched as her face slowly morphed from what I thought was shock into a growing rush of excitement. Wow, I've never had a vegan, but I've always wondered, she suddenly said, just as suddenly gone quiet. Wondered? I thought aloud. My brain started to wander back to that joke that I had seen in that unfinished assessment, that very irrational fear growing in my mind. Oh, I've just always heard all the positive things it can do for the flesh, being grass-grown and grain-fed. I wanted to jump out of my seat and run away. It was almost comical how weird this woman was. Like this was some sort of running joke she had done for years, but I just felt so very much in danger. I snuck a look at the clock at the bottom corner of my laptop. I'd only gotten through 10 minutes of the needed hour. I remembered why I was here. 9.5 years. I needed 10. Thank you, I think. I choked out, feeling increasingly hot. Now, may we please begin? Yes, very well, Maeve said. This won't be long, after all. I felt a weight lift off of my shoulders. One step closer to being done. One step closer to getting the hell out of here. One step closer to finally getting out of... But just so you know, you're breaking a very sacred tradition in my family. You do know what day it is, don't you? Maeve interjected loudly across the table. It's March? I mumbled, checking the date on my chart. March 17th? Yes, but what is March 17th? Let me give you a hint, dearie. You're Irish. Very authentic Irish, as a matter of fact. Part of a sect that celebrates a very important tradition once a year. Do you know what it is? A sudden realization came over me, and I felt myself let out a laugh as I stated the obvious. It's St. Patrick's Day? I said, looking down to see if I'd worn green today. Oh, don't worry about being pinched, dear. We celebrate the true origins of the holiday around here. Do you know them, my dear? Maeve asked curiously. Of St. Patrick's Day? I think so, I said back, looking for the first question of my chart. No, not the fairy tale. The real story. There was something about how she said the last two words that made me feel very uncomfortable. But I had a sudden idea, as cultural considerations was a category in my assessment. If I let her tell the story, I could just sit and listen. She would just burn through most of the hour, and a loud whistle pierced my ears. As I looked through half-shut eyes towards the kitchen, eyeing a very large stainless steel pot rattling on the stove. Oh, don't mind that. The pressure cooker is preheating. I'll be adding the meat soon. You'll see. That's the centerpiece of our tradition around here. The feast. I felt my fingers typing subconsciously as I looked down at the screen and realized that the cultural considerations box I had written, I think these people are planning to eat me. Suddenly I felt very dizzy, as I was exactly where at least one of the 7 was, before she had just gone. I reached for a drink. Realizing that I had none, I took a sip of my soup. It was piping hot, and it did little to lower my blood's temperature. Why is it so hot in this house? I wondered, scanning the room for the thermostat. I noticed that there were no photos hung on the walls either. None of Maeve, none of her son. Yes, so most people think of St. Patrick's Day for the modern customs. Maeve began, pouring a second cup of tea. Of drinking, of green colours and coarse, of corned beef and cabbage. You mean corned beef, I corrected immediately, the words flying out of my mouth at warp speed. My mistake, of course, Maeve said, as she passed me a cup of tea. You admit it adds quite the ring to it, dearie. The pressure cooker whistled again in the kitchen, as I felt my eyes shoot over, the pot rattling even more violently than before. I realized it was the largest pressure cooker that I had ever seen. In fact, a lot of the pots and pans in the kitchen were oversized. Yes, so about our tradition, Maeve continued. The truth of St. Patrick's Day is it started in the 5th century. St. Patrick's is now known for excessive drinking and large festivals, which derived from the original ceremony. Which is what? I said as I brought the tea to my nose, allowing the aroma to linger in my nostrils. Well, the customary feast, of course, Maeve said, licking her lips. I allowed myself to taste the tea slowly. First, letting the hot porcelain sear my inner lip, hoping to wake me back up, before letting a tiny amount of the liquid drip onto my tongue. As I looked forward, I noticed Maeve had stopped speaking, but her mouth was still open, like she was waiting for something. Just as I went to take a full sip, I had a curious thought. I wasn't sure if I'd seen Maeve drink any of her tea herself. I slowly lowered the cup down and held it at my chest, trying my best to keep my hand still. It was strange. My nerves felt much calmer, but I had trouble controlling my body. Regardless, I forced my politest smile and nodded. I'm listening, Maeve, I said as softly as I could manage. Maeve smiled back. To this day, I don't know if she was just happy that I was invested in her story, happy that I didn't put my tea down, or just as happy as she was enjoying some sick game of cat and mouse. She simply continued. You see, the majority of the Irish of that day were very desperate, impoverished peasants who simply wanted to break up the monotonous lives with once a yearly feast. But cattle were hard to come by, and livestock were simply not in a surplus. So, St. Patrick had a solution that they had not considered. Do you know the conversation that he is most famous for? To Christianity? I stammered out, suddenly feeling dizzy, as I realized that I had absent-mindedly taken a small sip of tea, the heat in the house having my brain operating on instinct. I felt my vision suddenly blur. In that moment, I nearly slumped over, a bit of tea spilling onto my keyboard. Yes, he did convert to Christianity, but for some of them, he converted into something else, too, to ensure that a proper feast could take place. I stammered out. What's most interesting is how they decided who would provide the flesh needed for the feast. It's part of the tradition we still practice today. Consumption, leading to intoxication, leading to a collapsing on the floor, Maeve said. So go ahead, darling. Take a little nap, and I'll make sure you're right where you're meant to be come supper time. A thumping in my head forced my eyes shut, and I felt like I was falling down a flight of stairs about to crash into the bottom. As I forced my eyes open, I scanned the table, trying to find anything but Maeve's teeth, now exposed past her lips. and I noticed that the table was set for 2, not 3. I felt myself beginning to doze off, and I would have, honestly, if it not for the loud whistle of the pressure cooker calling for its next meal, ripping me back into reality. I popped straight up onto my feet. I really need to use the bathroom, I said, with a slur in my voice. In the hallway to your right, Maeve said, flashing an annoyance that I hadn't seen before, as I stole a glance at her watch. When I tell you I ran to the bathroom, trust me, I ran. As soon as I was inside, I closed the door, locked it, and slid down, my butt hitting the tiles with a thump. 7 years, 7 marches, and 7 missing co-workers. I was about to be 8. A sudden curious realization came over me. I couldn't have missed it before, could I? It would have been too obvious, too weird for me to notice. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and pulled up the electronic health chart. I accessed the assessment page. There were 7 incomplete assignments. Couldn't believe it. All 7 happened on March 17th. All 7 were on St. Patrick's Day. All 7 must have been part of whatever this family's tradition was. All 7 didn't exist on March 18th. And now that I thought about it, all 7 of them never got to the part where they... Honey, are you all right in there? I heard Maeve yell from the other room. You're going to be late for dinner if you don't hurry up. Just a minute, I yelled back. I started feverishly scrolling through the incomplete chart entries, sweat now pouring down my face. If the living room was hot, the bathroom was hotter. I ran the sink and scooped water into my mouth and flushed the toilet to buy some time. I couldn't believe it. I took one final minute to take a deep breath, stare at myself in the mirror until my vision cleared. I put on my best clinician face and raced back to the table and took a seat, ready for my next move. I appreciate the story, Miss Maeve. Thank you. But I think it's time I make your son. I have to interview him for the services to begin. It's a requirement, I said through a pursed smile. Oh, is that really necessary? Oh, is that really necessary? It's just that he's with someone. And ever since then, there's been a misunderstanding really about who he is, Maeve quipped. Regardless, he has to be a part of this assessment, or I have to leave, I said firmly. Oh, what's wrong, dear? You aren't staying for supper, Maeve said, doubt creeping in her voice for the first time. I decided to play along for just a moment. Part of it was revenge. Part of it was I really had to know. Was she really trying to eat me? Oh, I'd love to stay for dinner, honestly, I said. I bet I would find it all so delicious, I said, raising the tea back to my lips to see how she would react. As I expected, she flashed that eager, hungry stare that I'd seen before, leaning forward as she waited for me to take a sip. I realized solemnly that this was as close to the truth as I could risk getting to. But your assessment, more specifically your son's assessment, can't take place without him present. Since he's not here, I'm not billable, and therefore I'm required by Medicaid law to reschedule. But it has to be today. It has to be, Maeve said with a wail, the panicked sound raising the intensity of the moment. Time to exit stage left, I told myself. I stood up and began to pack my bag, trying to present as calmly as possible, even though I was anything but. I told you he'll be home any minute. You just have to be patient. Unless... Maeve said, the pause impossibly ominous. Unless what? I said impulsively, my curiosity literally trying to kill the cat. Unless you'd like to accuse me of something, darling? Maeve threatened back. I opened my mouth to speak, but I froze. What could I possibly say? You've insulted my culture by not accepting my snacks and my tea. You haven't written a single thing down since you've gotten here. And you won't wait for my son to come home so he can get what he's waited for all year. So, what is it really, Beth? What's the real reason you have to leave soon? If I've done something to offend you, name it. Otherwise, I'll be eager to report back to your supervisor that you left early because you're ignorant against the Irish. I stood, stunned as I processed the sudden realization that saying, because I think you're a cannibal and you're planning to eat me on St. Patrick's Day, was insane, and I had no rational way to explain myself or my behavior. I couldn't prove any of it. So, Maeve said, as she poured me a fresh glass of tea. I need you to prove to me that you're willing to embrace the true meaning of St. Patrick's Day and have tea with me, or I'm going to do everything in my power to have you fired for being racist. Someone who has wasted my holiday refusing to fill their role. What will it be? I pulled my phone out of my pocket, desperate for some good news. I felt my body slump over as I saw the time was 25 minutes short of being billable. I also had a push notification that my student loan payment was due. I still owed over $26,000 on my master's degree, despite making the minimum payment for 9.5 years. But if I made it to 10 consecutive years, I'd be eligible for loan forgiveness. The whistle of the pressure cooker sounded again, screaming for attention, and the preheat complete, ready to cook its next meal. What's it going to be, Corinth Beth? Maeve teased, hiding nothing as her tongue jutted out of her mouth. My head shook violently as I reached down to pick up the cup of tea and slowly raised it to my lips. I stalled for 3 deep breaths, feigning that I was cooling it down as I tried to process what to do next. I looked down as I noticed the cookies, cakes, and pastries were gone from the silver platter, having been cleared off when I was in the bathroom. The only thing left was my reflection staring back. I had to make a choice between what I knew was my reality and what I thought was my reality. I closed my eyes and began to tilt the cup back. It was just as I was about to taste, my lips wouldn't open. There was something deep inside me that just knew. I'm really sorry, I said. I can't explain it. I just have to go. I set the tea down and slung my laptop bag over my shoulder. I realized it would be for the last time. I'd be unemployed after this, and probably even lose my license. And even worse, somehow, I'd have no way to explain what happened today to anyone ever. It would be like I just disappeared. And just like the others, I grabbed my thermos and rushed straight out of the door. I pulled the doorknob and let a sigh of relief out as I saw Rosa waiting for me outside. Are you sure you won't stay for dinner, sweetie? Maeve called from behind me. No, I said, looking back and nodding goodbye. Well, have a happy St. Patrick's Day, Beth. It was a pleasure to almost know you. No hard feelings. I watched as Maeve raised the cup of tea to toast. Sudden curiosity came over me. I just had to know, so I stuffed my laptop bag into my other arm and raised my thermos of soup in response. I watched as Maeve drank her entire cup in one gulp. I felt like an idiot. I opened my thermos and raised it back to Maeve and smiled. She smiled back, flashing that same hungry look, but I didn't care anymore. I spent my career trying to help people. I wasn't going to end my last day by hurting someone. As I leaned my mug back and the broth hit my lips, I was startled, but it was very, very cold. My eyes widened and I spit it back into the thermos, and it simply just fell out of my hands, crashing to the entryway floor. I stumbled backwards, the doorknob jabbing my back, and through dazed vision, I saw Maeve standing up and started walking towards me. I forced my way out of that door, even as I felt Maeve grab my shoulder and tried to pull me back inside. I tripped down the stairs and collapsed face first onto the dirt outside, and realizing I couldn't get my feet under me, I felt a sudden rush of terror as I realized that this moment is the moment I'd die. I'd crash onto the floor, just as she said was part of her tradition. This is how they decided who supplied the flesh for the feast. As I turned onto my back and looked up at the doorway, I saw Maeve standing there, just as she had when I'd arrived. 1 foot outside the door, 1 inside. She didn't speak or move, just floated there, a look of disappointment that has haunted my dreams ever since. I caught my breath and found my footing, and then raced back to Rosa. I threw her in reverse and sped down that street. 7 years, 7 marches, 7 missing caseworkers. I was nearly 8. Or was I? I'll never be sure. I won't be going back this year to find out. There's one last piece that bothers me. I hit the main road and I saw 1 car pass me, traveling in the opposite direction, traveling towards that Cape Cod. I could have swore I knew what it was, but I'll never be sure. My vision was so blurry. I was so disorientated, so dehydrated, so dizzy. But the same feeling that screamed at me to leave has always told me that it was a green Mustang.